Well, welcome everyone to the general session on data. I am super excited about this conversation. This is where I get to geek out a little bit, just so bear with me. This is a real conversation, right? So this is just two people kind of talking, and I am thrilled to have Jeff Jones from Basel Data to join us to talk about growing your organization through impact data, right? That's what it's all about. And so we fielded a few questions from our affiliates, and we're going to take time throughout the conversation to kind of intersperse those questions and have Jeff kind of address them for us. My name, and I should have started there, my name is Mark Shamley. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for the World Federation of Youth Clubs. And joining me is Jeff Jones, who is the founder of Basel Data, where, if I got this right, Jeff, Basel Data is a do-good data analytics company, right? So that's really important in terms of a distinction. So Jeff,
in its simplest terms, that's exactly it.
Yeah, welcome. Thank you for joining us and being part of the conference and being available to have this conversation. So why don't we start with just you kind of telling us a little bit about yourself, right? You know, you have such, I will tell you, a fascinating background and how you landed in being the founder of this data company. So I'm gonna just turn it over to you, Jeff, and share.
Cool, that sounds great. First, I want to say thanks and thanks for having me. I want to show my appreciation for what you do, Mark, what everyone listening does. I was a participant in many youth clubs as a kid. I was part of the Boys and Girls Club. My siblings were part of the Boys and Girls Club. I was a little brother, part of the Big Brother, Big Sisters organization in Wisconsin. And I'm now a big brother and a mentor in different youth programs. So just to start with, thanks for
well, we have something in common, Jeff. I'm a big as well, and I've been a big for about 7 years. And I also, you know, once you're part of the Boys and Girls Clubs movement, it stays in you. So I had the opportunity of working with BGCA for a number of years. So it's great to hear that you are a product of the youth development movement, which is fantastic.
Yeah, near and dear to my personal growth, for sure. So
wow,
thank you for that. So yeah, well, my path to the social sector is not, I don't know that there is a traditional path, but mine is definitely not that. I studied aeronautical engineering and worked as a reliability engineer for about 10 years. That's a reliability engineer, for those that don't know, we basically do statistical analysis to understand, to predict when things will fail, electromechanical components, why things will fail, when they will fail. But effectively, it's just data analysis at a very defined level. I did that and realized pretty quickly that I was good at the understanding and communicating data part. I hated being in a lab. I hated sitting in a room with no one else and measuring the finest points of a failure or of a component. I hated that, but I loved the data. I loved being able to talk to people about how something works, what we're learning with these very fine data points, and I was good at it. And I realized that there was an opportunity to be more purposeful with that skill set.
Right.
And I started volunteering. Really, I spent about a year just volunteering for different youth programs. At the time, I was in Southern California. I literally walked into an organization that we worked with for a while and said, what data do you have? How can I help? Would you like me to do some analysis? And I spent some time there, but actually spent about 3 or 4 months analyzing some data with them, and realized that this lack of technical expertise was pretty common.
Right.
They introduced me to other organizations. We talked about what they could do with their data, what data they were missing, and it really just turned into a kind of a passion where I just kind of jumped from one organization to the next. I mentioned I spent about a year doing that, but in tandem, I went back to school to learn a little bit more about development economics, more about global poverty,
Wow.
and spent a lot of time just understanding the social sector. I understood the technical side really well, but I needed to spend time on the social side. So I did that, and then about 3 years ago, I started Basil, and Basil was just an idea to do social impact data analysis. It wasn't what I thought. It has turned into something more, of course, but I thought I would just be able to help with the technical side. What it's turned into is really more than that. We absolutely help with the analysis, but it really turned into more of a strategizing, understanding data, creating a framework around a specific impact objective. Impact is nuanced, right? Everyone has a very specific story, especially when you're working with individuals. So we work to create a framework to really give an organization the steps that are necessary to feel more confident in their data. And that's what we do now. We partner with foundations and social impact accelerators in order to help their participants understand impact data a little bit more.
Great. Jeff, thank you for that. That's really helpful in terms of setting the context for this conversation and your work, especially with one on the technical side, but ultimately how that shifted more broadly around strategy and the analytics. What do you do with the data, right? What happens with the information that you're collecting?
Right.
What fascinated me about sort of your journey around working with all of these organizations, I would imagine that many of them are in varying degrees of maturity, some very advanced, some in that middle stage, and then some sort of those early stage organizations. Absolutely. At the World Federation, we have that same kind of diversity, if you will. But one of the things that I think is really important is around those early stage organizations. Like, how do they start to sort of shift in terms of their approach, both on the technical side, but then also on the strategy side? How do you, what would you sort of share based on your experience around early stages of social impact work and using data to help sort of make better data-driven decisions?
Yeah, that's a really great place to start. My expertise has really fallen into that early stage organization or small nonprofit realm, and what we've put into our framework, really the first few steps within the data collection or the data strategy framework, is understanding your stakeholder and understanding your objective. But you almost can't do anything without those two pieces in place. And not just understanding one stakeholder, not understanding your primary stakeholder. In this case, it might be, youth ages 5 to 15 or something. It needs to be every stakeholder, internal stakeholders, your beneficiaries, right? Your staff. Really lay out what you do and how it would affect all of them. And then also looking at the potential unintended objectives, right? You could have negative impact that you're, for lack of a better word, you're ignoring. So understanding those objectives, both from a positive and negative standpoint, is really important. And that's the place to start. That's just sitting down with your team and understanding those two things is imperative.
Got it. What would you say are a couple of like myths, like things that, people are kind of walking around about data, like, oh, you have to have a huge budget or department, or, what are some of the things that you can dispel pretty quickly in this conversation?
Yeah, you pointed to the first one right away. Lack of resources is not the enemy of good data, right? I would say the first thing that comes to mind really is inconsistency is probably the enemy of quality data. That's what we work towards, right? Developing the framework, you put in the work early in order to understand what you're going to do, understand who your stakeholders are. Right. But then operating gets easier, right? And that's really the second myth. Right. It's not extremely difficult. Now, it is understanding specifically your contribution can be difficult, but understanding your outcomes doesn't have to be difficult.
Okay.
And when I say that, I mean, there are a lot of things affecting your beneficiary, a lot of things affecting your stakeholders, and you might not be able to identify specifically your contribution to their well-being. But you do know that you're able to offer them a little bit more, and you can measure that. You can measure your outcomes with an appropriate survey or an appropriate data strategy. And that doesn't have to be difficult. It just needs to be consistent. You need to be asking the right questions monthly or quarterly. You need to be monitoring what your staff is doing. But it doesn't have to be hard. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. So as I mentioned, Jeff, we took the opportunity ahead of our session together to ask a few of our affiliates just kind of what are some questions some burning data questions that you might have. So maybe we'll pause right now, take a question, and then we'll continue on with the conversation. How's that?
Okay. All right. That sounds good.
Question number one. All right, this is around data do-it-yourself. Okay, so how can organizations with limited resources, again, we were just talking about this, shift to practicing data management as opposed to data collection, and ensure that the data is, of course, reliable?
Right. So this really goes back to that upfront effort. Right. If you already understand your stakeholders and impact objectives, the first step is getting started with a simple survey or a simple program analysis, but getting started with a small team or a small sample size. Okay. If you've already put in that upfront effort to understand your stakeholders and objectives, it's really unfortunate if you don't push that through. Right. And often just taking that first step will help you realize that you can do this, right? And when I say making that small first step, what I mean is talk to your team about your resources, right? What can you do? Create that survey or that assessment, and then test it. Test it with a handful, a small sample size, and then you'll start getting data back, and you'll know if it's the right data. Or can we do something with this? And that doesn't have to take a long time. Be realistic, right? Maybe it's going to be a month, maybe it's going to be a couple months. Right. Be realistic about that, but take that first step, understand what you get back, adjust if you need to, and then continue. You're always going to have to adjust to get more data or more reliable data, and that's okay. You really just have to start gathering those insights, because the ultimate goal here is to be better, is to identify best practices, is to continue to make an impact and grow your impact. And the only way you can do that is if you understand what you're getting and understand what you're doing from a beneficiary perspective.
Okay, great, thank you. Let's shift gears and talk a little bit about the kinds of data, right? qualitative, quantitative. You know, often in this space, there seems to be, you correct me if I'm wrong, right? But there seems to be a lot of, especially in the area of social impact work, sometimes there's a little bit too much emphasis on the quantitative data. Oh, I got to get numbers, I got to get this. But the storytelling and the qualitative stuff is also really important. And marrying those two things together, can you talk a little bit about types of data, what works, you know, what doesn't work? Like, how do you create the right kind of blend between those two things?
Sure.
Yeah.
So I love that question. I think it's intuitive today for people to think it's either qualitative or quantitative data. Right. And it once you start to understand data, once you take the first step, you could start to categorize the data that you get. But there are really we talk about 5 types of data.
Okay.
The first type of data is user or beneficiary characteristics.
Okay.
That's that's general demographics, right?
Okay.
Age, race, region, socioeconomic status, that kind of stuff, the things that you can get around the characteristics of your user. That's the first one. The second one, we call engagement data, but it's output data. It's the how often, for how long, how many. So how many people are participating in your program? How often are they coming back, and for how long? Right? Those are the outputs.
Can I ask one question about that, Jeff? I often hear when people talk about impact, you say, okay, tell me your impact. What you get back is output numbers, right? Mm-hmm. Numbers that, oh, we reached this many kids, we met that, it's like it's the numbers. But that's a different kind of thing. I know you'll get there, but yeah, it's important of a distinction because it's 2 different things, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely, Mark. Really, it's outputs are the easiest type of data to gather. And outputs can be proxies, right? Proxies for outcomes and for impact. You think of outputs as a necessary data set because they're needed. But what it doesn't tell you is outputs really don't tell you the effect you have. Right. They just tell you how many people you're working with. And we mentioned unintended impact, right? If you're having an unintended impact and you're growing your outputs, it just means you're having an unintended impact on more people. Right. And that's can be unfortunate, right? So yes, thank you for pointing that out. I think that's really important. The data point or the data category that you're talking about is outcomes.
Right. Okay.
Outcomes is the third one. Right. Outcomes is the short-term change that your stakeholders might be experiencing. Okay. Right. Impact is the impact is always the hardest one to measure. Impact data is the contribution you're making. So long-term change, long-term contribution you're having on these stakeholders, and it is really difficult to measure it in the sense that identifying your contribution can be tough outside of a randomized control trial. Right. It's tough to do that. But going back to the point about qualitative and quantitative, those can both outcome and impact can be qualitative or quantitative.
Okay.
The very last and I would say most important data category is feedback. Okay. Feedback is almost always qualitative, but it gives you an understanding of the story or the experience from your stakeholders. Mm-hmm. This is asking the question, how do they feel about what you're offering them? Is it important? Is it making a difference? Right? You do need that story, both from the standpoint of understanding your stakeholders, but also that story is really powerful when you go to the donors. It's really powerful when you work with investors, and all of those categories are important.
Okay, so let me just make sure I got them. Data type 1 is user information, demographics, beneficiary information. That's one. Number two is output, the numbers, right? Numbers of this, numbers of that, okay?
Yeah. How many for how long is a good way to.
How many, and that's also what you classified, or you call it engagement data, right? How many, how long, right?
Exactly.
Number three is outcomes, which is the short-term results, like noticeable changes, these kinds of things. But that's different than impact data, because that's long-term behavioral change. That's where you sort of invest a little bit more time and energy to really understand the effects of change that initiatives and programs might be having on a particular demographic group. And then finally, you got to go back and say, okay, get some feedback. And then ultimately that helps that feedback tell that story from a qualitative and a quantitative perspective. Do I have that right?
Yes. Perfect.
Right. Awesome. Awesome.
Yeah.
Great. Okay.
Now I will say this, Mark, there are nuances within each of them.
I'm sure.
I wish it was as easy as it could, as putting in, a question for each one of those data categories. But once you understand those categories, you're in a much better spot for it.
So where do people, in your experience, especially those early startup kind of organizations, right? Like, is it realistic, Jeff, to have that range of data? I don't want to call this sophistication, because that might not be the word, but depth across all 5 types. Do some kind of, like, can you do all 5 of them, but do it within the context of the size and scope of your organization, so you don't have big data sets? Like, what's your experience? What would you say to some of these folks who are on this call?
So your level of sophistication depends really on how many programs you have and how many stakeholders you're dealing with.
Okay.
If you're having to work with many different programs, maybe you have the same objective, but it's many different programs. You do need to house that data effectively. You need to manage it effectively, because in the end, you're going to just gather more insights if you can analyze it. With that said, there are ways to do this if you're running a survey a month, or on just a small sample size. Maybe it's a few hundred kids that are going through your program. That's easy enough to manage within a there are different resources, but within your own system. You just need to decide who's going to do it, who's going to be responsible for that.
Gotcha.
Because it really doesn't need to be someone responsible. It can't be someone's 10% of someone's job when they have a lot of other things to take care of. So just making it a point to monitor, whether it's a small amount of data or a large amount of data, making that point to monitor is important.
Okay. So why don't we take another affiliate question? I think this particular question seems really appropriate for this conversation we're having, because it's oriented around defining your data needs. And that's a little bit what we've just been talking about. So, some of our larger affiliates are challenged with the idea of data standardization, right? And what's happening is, how do you create a common set of data points across an organization that has multiple sites, right? And how do you approach that in a way where you get meaningful insight and meaningful data that represents the whole network, as opposed to you getting all this information but not necessarily tying it all together?
Mm-hmm. This is a great question, because when we talk about the stakeholder and the objective, if you have multiple units working on the same objective with similar stakeholders, you have the opportunity to get a lot of insights from different regions, with different demographics potentially. And it's really powerful when you can take a best practice from one unit and implement it at another, right? Because we've understood maybe one unit is gathering data really well, and we learn some really great things, and then we can implement it somewhere else. That's just a powerful use of data. But to get to that point, you need buy-in from each of those separate arms. Taking the time to agree on an objective and agree that we're working towards the same goal with the same stakeholders, it gives you the opportunity to reference back to that objective down the road, right? A couple months later, you're working, you're gathering a bunch of data, and you can say, this is wonderful because we know that this data is helping to get to a overarching objective that fits all of our clubs, and it's gonna provide us insights that we wouldn't have gained otherwise. But it is really important to get to that first step of agreeing on the objective, and that might be, without going into too much detail, that might be doing a theory of change together, doing a theory of change, right? That with all of your with each managing director or each arm there, doing a theory of change, being on the same page, and then taking the next step from there.
Can you just talk really briefly, Jeff, about that term theory of change, just so our folks really understand what you mean by that?
Yeah. Theory of change in really its simplest form is identifying the problem that you're trying to improve.
Okay.
And then walking through the process, the theory behind what you're doing that's going to show progress within that change.
Okay.
So you have a desired state and a current state, and you're trying to get from our status quo to that change and how you're going to do it. And you're going to agree on that with the appropriate people in the room.
Great, thank you. So let's turn to our another affiliate question. This one is an organization that is already buying in to the need for shifting their mindset into data, from data collection to data management, right? So they get it, right? But what they're trying to understand is the issue around data bias, right? And the collection process that can influence certain data results and outcome in the process that is gathering this information. What would you say, how would you sort of counsel an organization who is dealing with or trying to address how to make sure that they have sound data integrity and build that into their process so that data bias isn't influencing the results that they're getting?
You know, in academia, the right answer is running a randomized control trial.
Right.
Randomized control trials, right, take a lot of resources, a lot of thought, and even RCTs are not necessarily perfect.
Right.
There will always be some bias in surveying. That is not an excuse. There are wonderful tools now, right? We have these digital options that make it easier to minimize bias. And if you have the means, just writing a survey that is presented the same way to everybody taking that survey is a good place to start, right? It means it's the same question and it's offered the same way. And maybe it's on a phone or on a emailed, or maybe they come to a common computer and fill out the survey there. But that minimizing the discrepancies between survey takers is probably the first
step. Okay.
First step. And then this one might be obvious, I'm not sure, but it's minimizing supervisor involvement.
Okay.
Right? Because then there's this sociability bias that someone thinks they're supposed to provide a certain answer, or and that level of bias that one's tough to control, but just kind of, letting someone answer the questions without someone's-
Supervisor collecting the survey information, right? Exactly. Yeah. I see. Yeah. It's good.
Those are probably the first two easy, or the first steps I would say that are relatively easy to implement. And then considering those 5 data categories and everything you do, right? That's another good way to minimize some externalities, some added bias that could exist.
Okay, great. Well, I think we are about to wrap this up, Jeff, and I can't tell you how thrilled this has been for someone who really, I enjoy this part of the work, right? Understanding and information and analytics, and I think the sector needs more of it. Before you go, could you just say if there are resources, online resources, point folks to, just any suggestions or recommendations before we have to let you go?
Sure. The first one that always comes to mind, that when we work with, especially those with limited resources, low cost options, is Airtable. Okay. Airtable is relatively new, but you can create your survey and your database in one location, and they do free training. I have nothing to do with Airtable, and but we've used it in the past because it's a relatively simple tool. There are many more impact data tools, impact measurement tools, software tools that are available. SOPACT is one in the United States. Social Value Engine is one in the UK and in the EU. We're a member of Social Value International. If you look at Social Value International's website, they list accredited tools that are really great references. But like I said before, getting started is the first step. And if you need a tool to do that, often Airtable, or even, if you get someone that's technical, combining Google Forms and Google Sheets, that's a good way to start, especially for small organizations. So if you need more information, feel free to reach out to me.
All right, sounds good.
I'm available, and we partner with other software programs too. So.
All right. Well, Jeff, thank you so much for your time, for your insight, your expertise. It's been a fantastic conversation, and we'll look forward to working with you in the future.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. This has been awesome. I love these conversations, so I'm happy to have more.
All right, terrific. Thanks.
Hi, I want to congratulate all the delegates of the International Federation of Youth Clubs as you join together at your annual conference. Your work around the world is so critically important, especially at this time of need. There's a lack of leaders, there's a lack of people who truly care about young people, and you all are filling that void, and it's so important. I also want to send my congratulations to my dear friend Rick Goings, to Glenn Permoy, Mark Shamley, and the entire team. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you. I know you all wish you could be together in person. Next year we will. I urge you to continue this important work. I wish you the best of luck, and I hope to see you soon.